Good evening, everyone. We've got about 2 minutes to go before, actually 1 minute before we start tonight's agenda. Welcome to the Monday, January 24th, Maplewood City Council Manager Workshop. Ms. Sint, would you do the roll call for us, please?
Councilmember Cave.
Here.
Councilmember Juniman.
Here.
Councilmember Knudsen.
Here.
Councilmember Villavicencio.
Here.
Mayor Abrams.
Here as well. First agenda item is the approval of the agenda. Is there a motion?
I move approval.
There's second. Moved by Juniman, seconded by Cave, the motion to approve the agenda for tonight's workshop. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, then let's go to a vote. And the order tonight is Council members Juniman, Knudsen, Cave, and Villavicencio. Councilmember Juniman, how do you vote?
Aye.
Councilmember Knudsen,
Aye.
Councilmember Cave,
Aye.
and Councilmember Villavicencio.
Aye.
I vote aye as well. The agenda is approved. We have 2 unfinished business items on the workshop agenda tonight, and both of them belong to Ms. Pulseth. So let's start with the allocation of ARPA funding. Ms. Pulseth, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and Council. Let me share my screen. Okay, and then we'll see if we can get this slideshow going. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. And then we want to, I believe, now you can see the full screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So tonight we had a couple of items on the consent agenda, and we talked about it and thought it would really benefit to have a workshop beforehand because they deserve a little extra time. And we've talked about them briefly a couple of times at council meetings before, but this will allow you in an informal setting to talk a little bit deeper about it and ask questions. So the first one is the allocation of the American Rescue Plan Act, or the ARPA funding, and that is on the consent agenda tonight. And what the action tonight is to allocate the first half, so the amount that was received in 2021. And we have those calculations made, and we'll go over that in a few minutes. Just briefly, as an overview, the city of Maplewood received 4.4 million, 4.468 million in ARPA funding. As you can see, 4.3 of that was our regular allocation, and we received an additional allocation, and this was based on a number of cities in Minnesota. Cities or local governments, I should say, did not accept their ARPA funding or did not apply for it, one or the other. And so on a population basis, the state of Minnesota distributed it to those of us who wanted it. So I don't remember how many million it was, but Maplewood share was 141,000. So that was nice. So the total 4.468 million, half of that was received in July and half of it will be received in July of this year. So what we are going to be talking about tonight is that first or mostly tonight is the action that you're going to be taking is that first half. Just briefly, the act allows for 4 broad categories for expenditures. I call them buckets. So if you hear me say buckets, that's what I mean. Response to the COVID-19 public health emergency. So that means anything that we had to spend in terms of personnel costs or equipment, PPE, as a result of COVID. The second one is premium pay for essential workers. That's new compared to what we had in the CARES grant. So as this year, as this whole process played out over this last year, they did expand that definition of premium pay to pretty much include, any governmental worker. Number 3, the provision of governmental services to the extent of reduction of revenue. So I'll try to explain that one because that one's going to really come into play. So what it means is governmental services. So anything that the government can legally spend money on, but only to the extent of the reduction of revenue. So we had to go through this calculation to determine how much revenue the city lost in 2020 compared to 2019, and then do that calculation again for 2021 compared to 2020. And literally, that the federal government had us, standing on our heads, eating a bale of hay, making these calculations, trying to figure out, how much we could spend, without any kind of restriction. And, in the end, they just issued the final rule maybe a week, 10 days ago, maybe. And in the end, they decided that all local governments can spend up to 10 million in this bucket or in this category. So that's over twice as much as Maplewood's even receiving. 90% of the cities and 70% of the counties nationwide will actually be able to benefit from this because they receive less than the 10 million. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. We all of our planning went according to these buckets, and we knew that the entire first half was subject to reduction in revenue. We had that much difference in our revenues, but we didn't know what this next year was going to bring. Preliminary analysis of it, when I look at it, it looks like our entire grant would be able to be spent under this bucket with reduction in revenue. And now there's no questions asked. We can spend it on any governmental service. So just wanted to spend a little bit of extra time because that just changed within the last couple of weeks. And I've been working with our auditors and with our attorneys, walking through this, trying to figure out the best route to go for all of these various different expenditures. There's a lot of other grants, rules, regulations, laws that come into play, including the federal grant guidelines, the uniform grant guidance that comes into play. These things don't always marry up that well. So the ARPA guidance says one thing and some of our other rules say another thing. So we kind of walk through various different scenarios to figure out the best route to take. And obviously the fourth one was the infrastructure investments. So this is the preliminary spending plan. It's been tweaked just a little bit that we talked about a number of times. So the items that are in blue are the items that you're going to be acting on tonight or considering tonight for action. And the items that are in red are something that's happening in the future. And the items that are in green are the items that you have basically already acted on by transferring those amounts to the EDA, and then the EDA will act on them. They've already acted on one, and they will be acting on the YMCA one or considering the YMCA one in the near future. So just to break it down one by one, the premium pay for 2021 basically means each government employee, so each city employee that belong to a bargaining unit that accepted their contract. So we still have some contracts that have not. So 245,000 has been spent on premium pay for essential workers. And so that is basically any city worker who had who accepted that premium 2% or $2,000 payment that the council approved in the mid-year. So that's already been spent. And then you will just be acting to allocate that tonight to allow the grant funds to reimburse the general fund for it. We're just estimating 260,000 for the remaining contracts. It might be a little bit more, might be a little bit less. So these numbers will be tweaked a little bit. The COVID response pay, that relates to personnel costs. So for instance, if you recall with the CARES grant funding, it was much more significant, but the grant, this bucket was scaled down a bit, even though that doesn't matter anymore. But we already kind of categorized it that way. So the COVID response pay means those employees, personnel costs for those employees who were responding to the pandemic in some way. So for instance, the lobby employees that we had working the lobby out in the DMV, working the appointments and working the scheduling and the traffic flow, those two employees are included in there. Those employees are no longer on the city's payroll, but they were in 2021. And so this reimburses the general fund for those expenses and some additional expenses from our public health and public safety salaries. Not a lot, less than 2%, maybe 1.7%, something like that of our total payroll, but enough to cover the additional costs that were required by personnel. The COVID leave pay, that means those employees who had to take leave because they either had COVID or had an exposure, at least those who reported it and entered it into their timesheet that way. That's the cost of that for the year. This will take money from the grant fund then to reimburse the general fund for that. The PPE is the equipment and personal protective equipment. And it also does include some of the IT costs that have been ongoing with regard to remote meetings and some of the DMV appointments and things like that. So there's some IT costs in there as well. Now, this will also be reimbursed in the general fund. The testing will be for 2022, so that's future. The fire department is going to be providing some testing until the federal government or whoever may come in and provide it, but the fire department will provide it to the extent that we have funding. The social worker, that's that person is just getting going, just starting. So that's going to be a future expenditure in 2022. That is going to be through the end of 2024 to cover the extra social worker. And there's probably more money shown in this estimate than what's actually needed. But again, these will be tweaked. The mall security in the YMCA has already been, those funds have already been transferred to the EDA, and the EDA will be acting on the YMCA one within this first quarter, I believe in April. And then the fire equipment was the ladder truck and the pumper truck. And that again is in the future. I believe it's on the agenda tonight to be ordered. We'll cover that in a little more detail in the next slide. The ambulance equipment is the ambulances that were in the CIP for through 2024. And I'll talk a little bit more in depth about that. If there was a true revenue loss, let's just forgo talking about the calculation that the federal government had us do, but if there was a true revenue loss that the city experienced, it was in the ambulance fund because the calls went way down when COVID hit. Nobody wanted to ride the ambulance. They thought they would get COVID in the ambulance. So the calls went way down and there was a revenue loss of about $750,000. It just happens that those two things aligned. The amount of the ambulance in the CIP purchases and the amount of revenue loss. And the plan for purchasing those ambulances in the next 4 years was to use surplus fund balance in the ambulance fund. So this will replace that lost revenue and allow those ambulances to be purchased with cash from the ambulance fund rather than borrowing. So the action then that you would be looking at tonight on the council agenda would be those things we just discussed. The expenses in 2021 for response to the COVID-19 in terms of the personnel costs that were spent. This would reimburse the general fund, and it would get booked as a transfer receivable back to 2021. So it would hit the books in 2021. The response for PPE, $39,000, and then the leave pay, $40,000. Premium pay for essential workers, $245,000. And then the revenue loss for the ambulance, that $750,000 would get transferred to the ambulance fund. It would be parked there until the ambulances were purchased, and we would dedicate or designate the fund balance for that purpose in the enterprise fund. And finally, the remainder. So when I say remainder, I mean the remainder of the 1.8 million. So the allotment received in 2021 was 2.2 or 2.3 million. Some of that was already transferred to the EDA. $390,000 was transferred to the EDA for the business purposes. And then the 1.8 million is the remainder that you'll be allocating tonight. So then the remainder of that is also funding that will be claimed under the revenue loss provision of the grant and transferred to the fire equipment fund for the ladder truck. And when the remaining funds reach the city in 2022, then you will do another allocation or consider another allocation for the remainder of the funds needed for the ladder truck and the pumper truck. I know this is kind of confusing, but we're just about done, so you'll have plenty of time for questions. Again, all of these grant expenditures, just like anything else we do in our budget, has to align with our strategic priorities. So as you noticed, there wasn't any funding that was being transferred from ARPA to the EDA for housing rehabilitation, so we're going to get to that. And again, this has to do with basically finding the best route to do these expenditures legally, and also in the way that it provides us more flexibility and less strings attached in terms of federal government reporting. So now we'll revert to talking about a little bit of a separate topic. So you will recall that in 2020, the city had a general fund surplus of 2.5 million above and beyond our desired level of 50% of our total expenditures. So that was above and beyond what we needed for cash flow. The reason for that was primarily because of the CARES money reimbursing the general fund for wages that were considered not lost, but wages that were redirected to addressing the pandemic, and other expenditures as well. We also had a banner year for building permits that year, and we had a lot of vacancies in the police department. A lot of reasons for this, but it was a 2.5 million over and above our 50% cash flow requirements. So the city council committed that at that time for the North Fire Station, simply because we had no other funding source if the sale of the London Lane did not go through. And it, you know, as you recall, it did not. So now that we are looking at that happening, the settlement happening in January of this month, this year, the council can go ahead and consider those surplus allocations. These are the ones that you've had in front of you a couple of times, maybe tweaked slightly. So the proposal tonight would be to take 1.5 million of that 2.5 million and distribute it now. We did talk about the need to have the employee benefits fund so that the liabilities match the assets. This would provide the cash in the fund. It's not going anywhere, but it would fund the liabilities, and those liabilities are basically severance pay and sick pay for when people leave, PTO pay for when people leave the city, employees leave the city. It's been noted that we're a little bit short of meeting that requirement, but that money just sits there until it's needed. So it's kind of like having a nice little savings account, and this will bring it back up to about 2 million, which is what is needed. The second one is the building fund, the 200 and 250,000 amount that we've been levying every year for the building fund just isn't really keeping up with the projects, especially when we have like a roof project and significant, we need to save up for a couple, 3 years just to do the roof. This will really help that fund cash flow a little better. We've been really running right down to the wire with it. The public safety equipment fund, the same thing there. What's happened with COVID, the prices have gone up, and we've also lost a lot of the discounts that we were once able to get because before COVID. So until that's resolved, we've been running just too tight there, running deficit during the year and barely making up for it at the end of the year, depending on the amount of petitions, property tax petitions, because this is funded by property taxes. So that would really help put that fund in the black, as well as the public works fleet fund, 250,000 for that. That one is not so much that it's in the red now, but looking at it in the future, we have it laid out for 10 years. And with the cost of equipment, the projected cost of equipment increases, it's just going to be a little bit short. And this will help us shore it up a little bit, and we'll be able to plan to slowly increase the levy for that fund. And then finally, last but not least, the EDA fund then would receive $350,000. The EDA would then be able to utilize that funding with the existing fund balance. There are some funds in the EDA. I don't remember how much it is. I think it might be a couple $100,000. And then leverage the county funding that they're going to be able to provide from their ARPA funds for your housing rehabilitation. Get that off the ground, get a plan in place so we know just kind of exactly what you're going to need for funding, and we find a way to fund it going into the future. Maybe a lot of this is going to be revolving. We don't know yet, but once the EDA gets a plan in place, we'll have a better idea of how to continue funding it going forward, but this would be a good start. Again, we will be closing the books in approximately April of 2022. We're madly scrambling to get all the entries made and get ready for an audit. I do expect another surplus. It is early to say that. But I do. We've had another really big year with building permits and also a lot of vacancies in the police department. So the same situation repeated itself. That probably won't happen again. But we do have a surplus, and the transfer of the ARPA funding to the general fund to reimburse for some of the budgeted costs that we talked about earlier will also result in surplus. So we'll be able to turn around and have another discussion again after the audit, I think, and after you get your final audit report from the auditors in June. So we're not done talking about it, and there was still $1 million left there, but we're playing it safe and really only doing what's needed right now. And you can have more discussions when we close these books. So, any questions?
Thank you, Ms. Paulsett. I have to say that I don't know why there's such an echo.
I'm sorry about that. I hope I was able to come through for most of you.
Oh yeah, you were fine, but when I hear feedback when I'm talking.
Oh, okay.
Now you're all right.
Okay. Well, let's see if we can work this out. Anyway, thank you for that presentation. I know from the rest of the materials that we're going to be talking about later on in our meeting, especially under the consent agenda, you synthesized a lot of information. When I read that summary of the federal funds, and that was only 44 pages, the entire thing was 600 pages or something. It was, I really appreciate you being able to synthesize all of that into your very concise presentation. So I appreciate it. I hope my fellow council members and any residents who are listening, because this gets to be rather complex. So with that, let's see if there are any questions from council members. Councilmember Juniman.
No, thank you. Not at this time.
Councilmember Knudsen.
I don't have any questions, but I just think this thing is well balanced and it's actually brilliant. We look at the preliminary spending plan, we're mitigating expense concerns. So you've got, funds that we'd like to have, things that we need to replace. The social worker thing is something strategic we want to do, and building our equipment base. Then you go on to the recommended allocation, and those are all balance sheet issues. And funding a balance sheet is really difficult. Your sources have to be more taxes or windfall or something like that. And this thing really starts to fund our balance sheet, which again, like the EDA, we can choose to spend that money on an appropriate strategic investment. So this is great. That's all I got to say.
I agree. Thank you.
This is Rebecca. I think I'm next. I just want to say that I also think it's great. I just had one question, Ellie, and that is number 3 on the bucket list. Is that something that can change next allocation, or did they specifically say that those parameters are now for both allocations of the funds?
Good question.
Thank you, Councilmember Cave and Mayor Abrams and Councilmember Cave. So number 3, the provision of governmental services to the extent of reduction of revenue. So that now is the rule. Basically, it really takes away all the other buckets, because you can select up to 10 million. So that will apply to both this year and next year's allocation. Yes.
Okay.
If that was your question, I'm not sure.
Yeah, it was, just because, the rules that they can change parameters, and I didn't know if it still can be fluid, they can still change it next time. And Councilmember,
sorry, go ahead.
Nope.
This was what they call the final rule.
Okay.
And again, like you said, the bill from Congress was over 600 pages and the rule was over 400 pages, and it almost starts to look like a council packet. But they condensed it into 44 pages, and I know that you were interested in looking at that, so that's why I did attach it. But it does have, like I said, there's a lot of other legal things that we have to consider, and so that's why we I tried to word the council actions in a way that we can be a little bit more flexible with these buckets, depending on, we have a reporting coming up in April, and depending on further discussions with our legal counsel, whether or not. We've had a pretty good agreement, though, that we are pretty much 100% clear to spend the entire amount under bucket number 3, which is on any governmental service.
I 100% agree. I think you've done a wonderful job, and it was really easy how you explain things. And it's great to see how much freedom, I want to say, but the council has to put back into the city, put back into having funds go back to a safe place, and also being able to use funds like the EDA. And with all this that you recommended, you still had $1 million left over. And it's a nice position to be in for the city and for the staff and for council to go ahead with projects that we have. So it's just wonderful. So thank you, Ellie.
You're welcome. And I just want to clarify that the $1 million left over was in the fund balance from 2020. So there's $1 million left over there. And I'm going to say $500,000, but it's probably closer to $1 million that we'll be looking at in excess for 2021 in the general fund. So you'll have some more decision making to make as we move forward, just trying to do really what's necessary and what's safe right now.
Mayor, can I do a quick follow-up?
Sure, let me go through the list first and then
Okay.
we'll come back to you, okay? Thank you,
fine.
Councilmember Cave. Councilmember Villavicencio.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess my question is, well, first I want to say thank you, Ms. Paulseth, for the presentation. It was very easy to understand because this is really complicated and hard to understand at times. So I guess my question is that through bucket number 3, is there any way that we could restore any of the monies around the Parks Department?
Ms.
and Council-
Paulson.
Yep, Mayor and Council, yes. Provision of governmental services, so that's really at the discretion of the council. Pretty much anything. You cannot pay debt service with it, and you can't put it in a pension fund. But other than that, pretty much any governmental service. So yes, it applies to parks. Yes. Also, the surplus that is remaining and the surplus that you will be considering for 2021, any of that, obviously can apply to parks as well.
Thank you. Any other questions, Councilmember Villavicencio?
No.
Okay, back to Councilmember Knutson.
Thank you, Mayor. Just an observation, I guess it's a question too, is if we had to follow the 4 buckets, pretty much the same, I think we're going to be, it looks to me like we'd be fine. I mean, number 3 gives us a lot more freedom, but the way this is spread out, it looks to me like, we're going to be able to effectively use those funds as we'd like. Is that an accurate observation, or is it giving us?
Mayor and Council, that's absolutely correct. We have kind of been planning all year under the various buckets, not knowing how much revenue loss we were going to have in 2021. So trying to focus on whatever we could really justify in terms of grant documentation in the other buckets, so that we had more room, more freedom for everything that fell under number 3. Well, now anything really can fall under number 3. So you just have a great deal of flexibility, and we're just trying to. So we, when we record the expenditures for the grant, like for 2021, we may just record it all for governmental. It may be public safety salaries. It may be anything, just to immediately free up the money rather than letting it sit in the grant fund and waiting until the ladder truck comes to spend it. Why not free it up, sooner than later? And there are other grant guidelines, not related to ARPA, but in some of our other federal grants and uniform grant guidance, that there are some strings attached and just some tails with some of these things. And especially when it comes to capital equipment, you have to report to the federal government every year. And then you have to report if you ever sell it. And there's a lot of things that are the strings that are attached. So, we're trying to walk through the safest routes and the routes that give the council the most flexibility.
Now for the tough question. Does all of this, or does it affect the precedent? In other words, are we setting, funding sources for things that we might not be able to do in the future?
Ms. Paulseth.
Mayor and Council, I don't think so. I mean, I'm just trying to think through what you really meant
by the
by
premium
the question.
pay and all that. I mean, that's, everybody recognizes these are kind of situational kinds of things,
Yeah, and that's something that was specifically authorized under the. So I would not, because because but for this funding, there
Sure.
is no way that the city would have been able to provide it. So that isn't actually, we're reimbursing the city for an unbudgeted cost. So that's not, that 245,000 or whatever is not money that is going to end up in surplus. That was an unbudgeted cost, and but for the grant funding, the city would not have been able to do that. I mean, talking $500,000 in total or more that would have cost the city.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate
Hopefully
it.
not.
You know, final comment on this. I really appreciate the caution and the wisdom that we are all using in how we disperse these funds, because this really is a one-time thing. Yes, we had the CARES money first and we have the ARPA money second. But it is, in my estimation, this is not going to ever happen again. It's unprecedented that, we've been through now almost 2 years of a pandemic, and this really is the federal government stepping in and helping. And so I really appreciate that we are very cognizant of the fact that this is one-time money, that this is not designed to necessarily, I mean, we're not out buying sparkly things and spending this money foolishly. This is one-time money, and we're making some very good investments into our community with it. I look forward to the discussion that we can have after we go through the audit, and we can take another very cautious and prudent approach on what we can do with those funds that will be the very best that we can do for our city. So Ms. Paul says, thank you for your leadership and for your team working on this. I really appreciate it.
Mayor?
Yes, is Councilmember Juniman?
Yes, thank you. As I'm listening to my fellow council members, I'm letting the wheels go around in my head, and that's dangerous. But is there any, this is hard to ask. Were there places along the way as we're responding to the COVID problem where what we did came through county channels? So, you know what I mean? Like PPE or the whole homeless thing, let's not go there. Is there any place where there's a crossover where it would be a question for someone who was supposed to and who did take care of the issue? Do you know what I mean? Am I saying
Ms.
it?
Paulsett?
I will try. I'm not sure if I completely understand the question, Mayor and Council. We have worked in conjunction with the county and with FEMA. We have money coming from FEMA. We have had money coming from FEMA for a year and a half now, since we applied for it, over $200,000. So that will be basically, by the time we get it, another windfall. So some of these things we were able to charge, yes, to other revenue sources. As far as the county is concerned, they got their own funding. But we are able to work with them jointly on the housing, and maybe it's not the county itself, but the HRA on some of the housing rehabilitation. Did I answer your question correctly?
Yeah, well, and my question is convoluted, I grant you, but I guess what I'm thinking of, I mean, we have the homeless encampments and how to relocate people and all that. That became our responsibility. So we put that into one of our buckets, correct? Even though ultimately Health and Human Services is seen by everybody outside the structure as a county function.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. That's actually under bucket number 1, response to the COVID-19 public health emergency. And we did try to get FEMA to reimburse us for that, and they denied it. But we then took it out of our CARES funding. Sure. And so if we have the problem again, we will be able to tweak some of this future funding if we need to, or some of the reserves or whatever we don't have. That's typically not something that the city has to pay for.
Right.
But yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, council members, is there anything else These are the two agenda items. Councilmember Juniman, anything else?
No, thank you. That was my one question.
Okay,
Who goes-
Councilmember Knutson?
No,
Councilmember
thank-
Cave? Councilmember Cave?
No further questions. Thank you.
Okay, and Councilmember Villavicencio?
No, thank you.
All right, then we have exhausted our workshop agenda
Mayor?
tonight. Is that Councilmember Cave?
Okay. Yep, you're, I don't know if it's mine but you keep going in and out, your voice. I don't know if
Mr.
everyone else
Folds?
has it.
Mr. Folds, that was happening actually when I was listening to Ms. Paulseth
Yeah.
as well. Mr. Folds, do you have anything else that you can help us with that?
Mayor, I would just recommend maybe between now and the regular meeting to log off and log back on. I did hear from Ms. Paulseth just momentarily, but other than that, it's been fairly good on my end.
Okay,
Okay.
then we'll all do that. We
Okay.
will all get out of this and then come back into the Zoom
Okay.
meeting fresh and see if we get a better connection. Okay? All right, thank you for bringing that to my attention, Councilmember Cave. And with that, we are adjourned. See you all at 7.
Thank you.
Recording stopped.